You put this on me.
Let me explain.
Get this thing off, or I'm gonna rip your head off.
No.
No? You think I'm screwing with you?
Yes! You man, stop!
Hi there, my name is Dalfridge, and this is my review for Enslaved Odyssey to the West. Enslaved Odyssey to the West is a simple story of a young white farm girl and her man-slave called Monkey. Right, now all the racial insensitivities out of the way, let's get on with it. The game opens with Trip and Monkey in captivity aboard a slaver's vessel. Trip manages to escape from her pod and sabotage the ship, which allows Monkey to break out of his pod, and so he starts to chase after Trip and to try and escape from the ship. During the escape, Monkey gets knocked out, and Trip affixes him with a slave headband. This means if Monkey disobeys, he experiences immense physical pain, and if Trip dies, he dies. She tells Monkey that she will remove the headband once he has safely escorted her back to her home village, hence setting up the plot. This leads to an interesting relationship between the two protagonists. Monkey is unsurprisingly hostile towards Trip and possibly even hates her at the start, but he soon recognises he has no choice in the matter and must get home if he ever wants to be free. From here on, the story is fairly easy to work out. Trip gets home about halfway through the game to find her entire village has been captured or killed, so he must now go and chase after slaves at their base, which is called Pyramid. Even though the story is fairly obvious, it is well written. It is largely down to dialogue and the interactions between the characters. It's one of the few games I've played recently where the characters actually act fairly believably. Monkey at first accepts his fate and just gets on with it, but later on he and Trip actually go to like and depend on each other. One of the most surprising things to me for this game was that the comedy sidekick was actually quite funny. In my experience of video games, this is a miracle, like a giraffe. There are only really 3 main characters throughout the game, and they are fairly well defined. Monkey is a big muscly man who spends most of the game either fighting or climbing around. Trip is a small pretty woman who can't really defend herself beyond her little panic button. Later on you're introduced to Pigsy, who is fat and therefore comic relief. One of the few issues with Enslaved is that it's hard to tell when or where it's supposed to be set. The technology is clearly more advanced than ours, but apart from that it could easily be set at any time. In the opening chapter you ding the Statue of Liberty on your ship, and it doesn't look any different to how it does now, and there's also tattered American flags scattered around the early levels. A lot of this gives the feel that it could be set in the future, or it could be set in the past and we've regressed somehow, or it could be an alternate world entirely. It's very hard to tell. Also, as mentioned, there is the Statue of Liberty and the American flag scattered around, so it's quite clearly set in America. However, it has a very Eastern feel to the story. Although, in fairness, a part of that might be because I know it's based on an old Chinese story, so I assumed the West they were on an Odyssey to would be the West of the world. The art style in Enslaved is absolutely gorgeous to look at. The graphics are excellent, all the levels are beautifully designed. You start off working your way through dilapidated buildings which have been reclaimed by the flora. Later on you move into more industrial settings onto the insides of a giant mech. I spent quite a large portion of this game just admiring the background while I was climbing around. And while the game does seem to hold up the graphics for the most part, I did notice a couple of frame rate drops in the larger environments, especially if there are a lot of enemies around.
Okay, I'm all set.
Monkey, here comes the power surge. You ready?
Oh yeah. Do it.
Unfortunately, after all this praise for the writing and the look of the gameplay does let Enslaved down a bit. The majority of the game is made up from either simple platforming or fighting different types of mechs. The platforming aspect of this is very simple, normally a linear run through from one brightly highlighted handhold to the next with the occasional need to pick Trip up and throw her across a gap. The combat is also fairly repetitive, with very few different button combinations. The enemies aren't hugely varied either, there are about 4 or 5 different types of mech and they all fight in pretty much the same way. They block your attacks so you have to charge a stun, and then you see if they decide to interrupt you or let you hit that stun. There is some variation to this. Some enemies have faults which Trip will inform you of. These enemies allow you to do a special finishing move on them which will lead them to either stunning all enemies in the vicinity, exploding, dealing damage to a small area, or sometimes hijacking the mech's gun. This helps to break the monotony of the combat and adds a small amount of strategy to the fighting. The boss fights are also a bit of a letdown. The first time you fight the giant demolition ball-handed bastard it's okay, by the third time it gets a little stale. The other boss fights are repeated, the dogfights, are also incredibly dull. All you have to do is stun lock them with the staff, then attack until you chase them down to do the finisher. You can easily keep the dog locked the entire fight without letting it move, and it gets boring partway through the first time you encounter one. The other two bosses are a bit better, but seeing as you just dodge the rhino when it charges at you, and the last one is just a case of target shooting and ad management, they're both a little bit too simple. The controls can also occasionally let the game down. For the most part they are fluid and responsive, you can cancel mid-attack and go into a block for example. Other times though you will dispatch your mech only to find Monkey's brain is switched off and he won't move for a second or two. It doesn't happen hugely often and it's not the worst thing in the world, but when it does it's quite irritating. Especially if it is during one of the few sections where you're on a timer or trying to protect an objective. The camera is also a bit too tight in for the fighting sections. Due to the flashy nature of the combat, the amount of enemies, it can quite often be a bit of a clusterfuck and you can't see what you are doing or trying to attack. This just leads back into button bashing and hope you hit the mech you're trying to. This also detracts slightly from the art style of the game, because you can't really admire the background, you can just see your character filling the entire screen. Occasionally, Enslaved's controls also let it down on the platforming sections. There were quite a few times where I'd think I was in the correct place to climb up, only to see myself rolling into a wall as I was a couple of pixels off. This is especially irritating during the race section of the game. It is only one very short section, but still. There is also a nice little character upgrade system. Drip uses the slave collar to upgrade you somehow. It isn't really important, it's just a nice little touch. For some reason though they felt it was necessary to lock you out of your upgrades every now and then. It does make sense for storyline reasons, because it is during the parts where Monkey and Trip are separated for whatever reason, but it does mean there are fair chunks of the game where you're unable to spend your upgrade points. For example, before the final boss, you're completely locked out of this system. It means you gather a couple of hundred points, and you can't spend them just before the final fight of the game. Seems a little bit pointless. These complaints are fairly minor, and they don't ruin the game at all. For everything the game got wrong about the gameplay, it also did several other things right. The parts of the game where it lets you use the cloud, a strange hoverboard type thing that bears little resemblance to a cloud in any way, are great fun. You get to zoom around the maps and fluidly transition between being on or off the thing. The only issue I have is that they don't let you use it enough. You're told the first time you use it that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and it appears for the most part that it just doesn't. There are a few sections where you have to get tripping yourself past a group of mechs by one of you distracting them for the other. These parts are fairly simple to work out, but they play well and never seem out of place or use the usual bullshit insta-death tactics you would expect. Due to the fact that this game plays with an emphasis on art and story over gameplay, I assume there would be several quick-time events to get through, but I found myself to be very happily wrong on that front. There are plenty of places where they could have slotted them in, during the takedowns for the boss's example, but they never actually turn up. There are also platforming sections where the scenery falls or there are other traps, but they give you plenty of time to move to the next handhold, and the traps are rarely insta-death. They do punish you for your mistakes by removing chunks of health instead, which makes you more careful as you can die if you get too many wrong in a row, or at least disadvantage you for the next fight. There are also pseudo-stealth sections, which sound like they could be very annoying. Some mechs lie dormant with a pulsing radius of detection, and you're supposed to creep round them, but if you mess it up, which I personally did every time except for one, you just have to fight them off. No extras spawn in, there are no alarms, you don't have to restart from the last checkpoint, you just deal with however many there were at the start. You also have the option of hunting for a couple of different kinds of collectible items. The first kind, tech orbs, are similar to the red orbs in Devil May Cry. They're littered around levels in small amounts and they're dropped by each enemy, and they allow you to upgrade your skills. There are enough scattered around in obvious places that you can complete the game without really hunting them down, but if you want that little extra edge you can comb every area of the map to max yourself out. The other kind of collectible are masks, which show you a brief glimpse of an alternate world. These are fairly reminiscent of the Truth video from Assassin's Creed 2, and that you are shown a small segment of video that means very little on its own, but by the end of the game it all makes sense. Both of these types of collectibles feel like they add to the game if you choose to chase them down, but you're not really punished or missing out on anything major if you do choose to skip them.
Trip, you okay?
Yeah, fine.
Freeze! Good. Now when I give the say-so, you're gonna turn. Very slow. Any tricks, I'm gonna light you up. Now turn.
I found this use of common gameplay elements, but free of the usual bullshit thing, to be a bit of a theme with Enslaved. It felt to me a bit like Escort Quest the game, and if anyone had said that to me before I bought it, then I would have completely been put off. But on the contrary, all the usual things that are in Escort Quest just aren't there. You get punished for your mistakes, but not game overed instantly. It's kind of like if that shit part of Metal Gear Solid 2, where you had to lead Octagon's sister around by the hand, and if you let go for even a second, she fell over crying, only for her to get killed shortly afterwards, had been done well. Sorry, I got a little bit ranty there. I hate that part of Metal Gear Solid 2. Overall, Enslaved is a very enjoyable game. It does have one or two issues, but each one is either a minor niggle or made up for by another part of gameplay. I was very pleasantly surprised by this game. I'm unsure as to why my expectations were so low, to be honest. It's possibly because I've been playing far too many bargain bin games as of late.